Okay, I'll begin with a few quick apologies. Firstly, to everybody for my appalling lateness today. And in advance for what will be quite a ropey PowerPoint. This presentation is very much a work in progress. It wasn't supposed to be new, but over the last 48 hours or so, it sort of became new. So what you're seeing is a first draft, and towards the end that will be very clear, but I hope you can forgive that. I'd like to begin the talk by thanking Cosmin and his team for having us, and for this invitation to consider, in particular, at least two notions together, the contemporary and the spectral. Further, to consider them in relation to the international, to an international with a capital I, and even to a new international. A call for vision then, and while I'll present what's bound to seem some quite discouraging evidence, I hope I can do justice to this call by also offering something a little more speculative and hopeful. For now, let me call it the preternational, and I hope you will indulge this neologism of mine. The referent here, the preternatural, names that which is inexplicable by ordinary means, beside or beyond the natural, and yet not necessarily supernatural, although it does often carry that implication. With preternational, which I won't dare to define here today, I'd want merely to posit a space that is determined in relation to the national, relation to nation, yet not reducible to its terms or its logic. Its beyondness may be spatial, but it might also be cultural, or juridical, or temporal. Perhaps in the spirit of Jacques Derrida's contretemps, untimely with respect to some national narrative, becoming, or destiny. Such an untimeliness, haunting our contemporary and perhaps aroused by the apparent death of a certain internationalism, is perhaps what prompted Derrida to return some 20 years ago now to a history of haunting. I'm pleased for the pretext for revisiting spectres of Marx. Like the art historical enterprise broadly, an exercise in filiation and the determination of an inheritance. Though filiation and progeniture may well be matters that one would rather avoid when speaking, as I will, of resolutely monarchic Thailand and its resolute but doomed monarchy. And yet I set out in, quote, fidelity to the inheritance of a certain spirit. Now, I shall not presume to address you as Marxists, even in Derrida's sense, but rather ask whether we might take his cue and look for a contemporary and an international that are radical in precisely this way, open to their own transformation. But finding the basis for a new internationalism will of course require reconciliation with past ones. And our hosts are again right that this special administrative region is just the place for such a reflection. Yet, for those of us engaged with Southeast Asia, the task comes freighted with some formidable Cold War baggage. Mutant and counterfeit internationalisms, plural and contingent, fait accompli internationalisms, stillborn internationalisms, acknowledged and unacknowledged, parochial internationalisms, if such a thing is possible. The haunting that makes manifest our regional political contemporaneity refers to these internationalisms, variously lapsed, repressed, or undead, and to their spectres. And rather more unabashedly than one might expect, their favourite parapet seems to be the digital video image. Now, excuse my very rough and poorly captioned presentation. The hapless farmer communists being channeled in Apichatpong Wirasetakун's primitive project. The Muslim communists of Amir Muhammad's video essay Apa Kabar Orang Kampung, or Village People radio show, which is on the long exiled Malay regiment of the Malayan Communist Party, ending their days quietly in the south of Thailand. Or the mystic animist Malayan Ware communists of Ho Tzu Nyen's tropical Gothic 10,000 Tigers project, currently in development. The casino communists of Patty Chang and David Kelly's Route 3, set in the special economic zone linking southern China to its new Mekong food bowl via Laos. And perhaps most unquiet just now, the Indonesian Chinese shopkeeper communists of Joshua Oppenheimer's stunning exercise in ethnographic complicity, The Act of Killing, a film that broaches all that we might wish to say about this region's perverted nationalisms and their many abuses of the international. So, where Derrida would disentangle his certain spirit of Marxism from a totalitarian monstrosity, as he puts it, Southeast Asia's bugbears are a more eclectic lot, authoritarian to be sure, but also hybrid. Now, all these works are transnational in their scope. All are primarily pitched, whether by choice or necessity, at foreign audiences. Importantly, they are all reflexive exercises in which the medium, format, or the genre itself is subject to historical interrogation. And all engage regionally, not nation to nation, but via microhistories, clandestine channels across borderland identities, pre-national ethno-linguistic affinities, extraterritorial limbos, and untimely reconciliations. These works suggest both a geography and a specific hauntology, a geopolitical time code, which we will call, for argument's sake, contemporary, and which announces the returns of shared Cold War experiences that were, properly speaking, neither local national, nor regional, nor international, neither still pre-national, nor yet post-national, but all of the above. There's a kind of historical reality check that I'm in the habit of making in discussions about Southeast Asian art histories. What I've said elsewhere about video and about new media art, we could also say of the contemporary. Though its emergence in the region may have been almost contemporaneous with its emergence in the West, we must insist upon a crucial distinction. For it emerged not in dialogue with liberal democracy and the bourgeois affluence thereby secured in the West, but in dialogue, though rarely as directly, with authoritarianism. Now, this means, inter alia, that in these parallel strands of a global art history, or a would-be global art history, art has had an utterly different relation to violence in general, to state violence in particular. Looking around, we may be in good company. Indeed, perhaps the Western European or US American story will come to seem a mere subplot. Sao Paulo-based analyst Sueli Rolnik notes how a certain historicization of 1960s and 70s Latin American conceptualism has skewed understandings of its legacy. Rolnik's insistence on art's micro-political register highlights the repressed and repressive colonial violence that animates both national modernities and globalization in post-colonial contexts. And it's tempting to sort of transpose this to Southeast Asia, although we find there, of course, quite different authoritarianisms, but to Indochina, say, to Indonesia, or to the Philippines, certainly places where a Cold War disfiguring of subjectivity stood upon older, localized repressive techniques, a complex that seems perhaps only lately to be coughing up some of its secrets. Now, Cosman's invitation made reference also to a mixed and yet purportedly common language of contemporary art, and to the abrupt and imperfect synchronicity of its only partially connected and only partially translated narratives. It's precisely the goal of my current research to try to isolate these partial connections and untranslated narratives. In historicising the contemporary in Thailand, I've been led to explore cultural histories far beyond those of modern visual art that better illuminate the contemporary being produced there and elsewhere, for consumption there and elsewhere. Signs taken to be signs of the global and globally legible are often anything but. And I feared that that might actually disqualify me from today's discussion of internationalism and multiculturalism, for Thailand hasn't much of either. Its cohesive governing ideology is one of chauvinist assimilation, in contrast, say, to Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, where some kind of cultural pluralism is hardwired into the program of modern statehood. My historicisation has therefore focused on a quite treacherous vocabulary, what I'm calling the 3 Cs: contemporaneity itself, conceptualism, and the curator. The passports under which certain species of modern art have been smuggled with demonstrable success in Thailand's case aboard the good ship International Contemporary Art. Put another way, these 3 Cs are lubricants, in fact, to abuse a phrase of Apinan Posianon's, of a certain internationalisation of Thai modern art. Were we to postulate contemporary art as vector of some kind of internationalism, as we're here to do today, we'd have to isolate these 3 lubricants that have been assimilating Thai art with a still dominant, if gradually less hegemonic, Western circuit and discursive machine. I'm sorry to report that the weight of evidence points to an exceptionalist or relativist conclusion, for these terms turn out to carry highly specific and contingent local meanings, meanings that are often at odds with their connotations in global circulation. What's passed for the curatorial, the conceptual, the contemporary in Thailand may not have passed elsewhere. The reverse is also true. The consensus or debate around these terms in the art world's global centres often does not reach its periphery. My intent is not just to expose the sometimes thin appropriation of these international stylings in Thailand, but also to critique those terms as they've been projected, with purportedly global meanings, in the ever trendier discourse around contemporaneity, or a world art history, if you like, in the parallel recuperation by the market of conceptualists. Think in recent years, Gordon Matta-Clark, Alighiero e Boetti, John Baldessari, and in the ascendancy of the curator as champion and chaperone of the conceptual, as prophet, progenitor, and midwife of the contemporary. For a would-be internationalist art history, the challenge is not merely terminological, it's epistemological. To what extent do such misappropriations inform, to what extent are they constitutive of, that functionally vague or deliberately inclusive notion of international contemporary art with which we're concerned? Jacques Rancière, in one of his many respinnings of the dyad that both enjoins but also keeps apart aesthetics and politics, makes 2 observations on this contemporary that I'd just like to flag very briefly here. First, the essential kinship between 2 strands of art that would prefer to see themselves as fundamentally divergent. One insists upon the ineffable, on art's fundamental and perhaps universal speechlessness, an art called, I quote Rancière, to bear witness to the fact of the unpresentable, which he associates with abstraction, with Jean-François Lyotard, and with Kant's sublime. The other is determined to disavow the very possibility of art's autonomy and proclaims instead a new modesty. But these two post-utopian modes are in fact cousins. Simply, I quote him again, the two strands that emerge by undoing the alliance between artistic radicality and political radicality. It's curious that Rancière's post-utopian contemporary, however unabashedly Judeo-Christian its premises, resonates quite far from its source. Both strands, you'll recall, are still quietly committed to the reimagining of community, a phrase that cannot fail to remind us of Benedict Anderson's theory of nationalism, which still quite actively haunts every academic discussion of Southeast Asia's modern cultures. The second observation of Rancière's is that this dual post-utopian contemporary occupies the oculocentric space inherited from Western painting. How obvious, right? It's blindingly so. The wood that so many of today's commentators haven't seen for contemporary art's cross-media hybridized trees. We haven't even begun, I don't think, to unpack the ramifications of this oversight, nor the second or third degree effects of receptions of modernisms concerned with the non-visual sensorium in Asia via art historical channels and vocabularies still heavily structured by the visual. Now, these reflections give me pause to reflect further on a show that I very fortunately stumbled upon just last month, an exemplary exhibition for our purposes of the late painter and poet Chang Se-tang, staged with the help of some rather unsubtle private support at a university gallery in Bangkok. And I'm grateful to Chiti Kasem Kidwatana for putting aside the catalogues for me, from which I've made a few very dodgy scans. Now, the two halves of Tang Chang abstract painting's concrete poetry even seem to anticipate the two sides of Rancière's post-radical family. These early monochrome paintings, this is a work, this is oil on canvas, it's a work called White on White from 1961. Curiously, Tang Chang's works are dated with our numbers, not Thai dates. I'm still working on trying to explain that. So these early monochromes give a sense of why Chang is rightly remembered as a pioneering modernist. A staunch individualist and autodidact, he stayed deliberately on the sidelines of institutional life and the market until his death in 1990. He did not conceal his Chinese heritage, but rather embraced it, very atypical for an artist of his generation. Hence his acknowledged but somewhat marginal position in the national canon. Now, the second, I'll scroll through a few of these to give you a sense of them. This is a little closer to the sort of work for which he is famed. There are hints of a kind of calligraphic expressionism. Now, the second, and I think more extraordinary half of this show in an adjacent gallery space comprised a suite of modest visual poems, or perhaps rebuses, many simply in biro on notepad paper, announced in the title of the show as concrete poetry. I'll show you a few of these as well. For those of, can everybody read the caption at the bottom? It's kind of small. It's the best I could do with an iPhone. I'll scroll through a selection of them first and perhaps then go back. Person confined by persons, 1979. These ones comprise the words for person and for dictator, both from 1980. Powerful people on a mound of corpses, 1984. The Democracy Monument, 1978. This is ballpoint on paper. Made in the late 70s and early 80s, the last authoritarian phase of Thailand's Cold War, as it thawed, they document a quite profound rumination on subjection, oppression, alienation, flight, and resignation, as the formal protagonist, Kon, the word for person, is endlessly reiterated, positioned, and repositioned with respect to other persons, living and dead, to birds and various other beasts, soldiers, police, forests, buildings and monuments, tax, dictators, and even Konba Amnat, or the power-crazed. It's hard to overlook the formal resemblance to the columns, crowds, and heaps of bodies that gave vivid images to the dramatic ruptures in the Thai social fabric in the mid-1970s, in the early to mid-1970s. Now, there are so many fascinating and contradictory ways that I would like to try to read this exhibition and its appearance at this particular moment in Thailand's history that I can't hope to do the show justice here. Very, very schematically, a recuperation of this Chinese modernist by the Thai academic system, drawing him further into the national canon and national market. A symbolic appropriation of the outsider, still an eccentric in that canon, by almost as marginal abstractionist professors of a second tier but now cashed up art school, catering well to a more and more forward and outward-looking Thai-Chinese middle class. A recuperation of China and Chinese culture by the Bangkok Sino-Thai elite, who tend to be collectors, as elsewhere in the region. Here, only a decade late for the dawn of an Asian century. But I'll pass over these intriguing Thai and Chinese laundries in favour of a simpler stylistic wash, a contemporary one, in step with the wider global recuperation of conceptualism that I've mentioned already. The catalogue texts that give colour to this many-layered reconstruction, one by the artist's own son, who curated the exhibition, hardly make matters easier. In a stream of hagiographic hyperbole, touchingly guileless, there is scarcely a modernist epithet missing. Chung was avant-garde, of course, a trailblazer, a visionary master abstractionist. He was a spiritualist and learned Taoist philosopher-poet. He was not only modern, but indeed, quote, transcended modernity, a vanguard postmodernist. He was herald of both the contemporary and the international, though the designation concrete poetry doesn't quite point where we'd expect. This is from the catalogue text that I mentioned. Abstract painting and concrete poetry are significant new philosophical discoveries and masterpieces of Chung that have not been influenced by Westerners. They are developments from their own roots in Eastern civilization, which is profound and beautiful. With these, Chung becomes a significant figure in Thai art history. That his name and his works must be documented. Tung Chung, a poet, a painter and a philosopher, is the first creator of abstract art and concrete poetry in Thailand. Now, I'm not going to try to make sense of this guff. The author may well be right, indeed, that Chung drew more from the pictographic tradition of his familial culture than he did from European experimental literature. But would it matter for the sake of a conceptualist designation? Even if we stress his Chinese intellectual heritage, can we avoid also misappropriating the intellectual legitimacy of a Euro-American vanguard tradition, of a progress initiated within the space of figurative painting in a galaxy far, far away. This is my favourite one. Person is a worm, worm is a person, 1984. Would this mixed inheritance not in fact point to quite a different legacy? And with the global art market recalibrating and recentering itself around East Asia, might not a bi- or even tricultural reckoning with the free-floating sign, with art and language, do wonders for an artist's contemporary currency? I'll return later to the qualifications and the reservations that I have with regard to these, what I've called the 3 Cs, and indeed briefly to the kind of historicisation that I'd wish for them. For the International, in the meantime, beckons with another cautionary tale with ramifications, I would argue, for all 3 of those terms. Now, I'm unsure what this term, internationalism, might mean to my friends in Bangkok. I don't believe I've ever heard it uttered there. There's no simple international variant of chatniom, which is the word for nationalism. The adjective international, nanachat, closer in spirit to multinational. It has a cumulative sense without the sense of betweenness or transcendence of difference. Now, certainly the international's prevailing idiolect in everyday language, at least in Thailand, clings to the loan word, in fact, and shortened at that to the prefix inter or inter. By inter means to go international. Dek inter is a child of the world. It's a form of making it, of graduation or distinction that typically means functional proficiency in some European language, greater earning power, if not affluence, enhanced social status tantamount to promotion on the class pecking order, an unspecified and unqualified sense of cultural sophistication, and sometimes, with gentle mockery, a getting too big for one's boots. But ironically, the inter is something that only really attaches to locals. Foreigners are either falang or kak or jek, in any case undifferentiated othernesses with roundly pejorative tones. Falang is the kind of blanket term for white people or Westerners. Kak is a more interesting, very old word which actually means guest, but is applied as a kind of racial slur to anybody with darker skin from anywhere from, you know, Arabia to I would imagine Papua New Guinea. And Jek is a much more common way of describing someone from China. So all of these obviously pejorative terms, but inter is different. It's only the Thais who can be inter. That which is international in origin is already falang and needn't graduate to the status of the inter. It's assumed to be accomplished, always already accomplished in these regards. All this suggests a deeply ingrained, more or less colonial reflex, further conditioned by a history of belated modernisation, technological catch-up, and defensive foreign and economic policy. With a glance at Thai cultural history, the internationalist knows he has his work cut out for him. The Thais' genius for cultural, ethical, racial relativism and their ease with the most superficial patinas of the international are very well known. An oldie but a goodie, this drawing published alongside one of the cultural edicts of the military dictatorship of Marshal Plak Pibun Songkram. This one, I think around 1941. Stylings promoted as Sarkon or universal. So here's another term that comes into play. Not incidentally, this kind of feckless disciplinary refashioning was contemporaneous with the foundation of Thai modern art, as many of you know, by an expatriate Italian named Corrado Ferrocci. It was always already international. The contemporary has therefore never meant a reorientation from the national towards the world, but was always, in fact, a redoubling or reiteration of a would-be worldly tendency that was integral to both political and aesthetic modernism. John Clarke has charted the iconography of this worldliness, a chain of more or less superficial citations of trending foreign styles. It's a superficiality indeed at the root of Thai modernity, of which the fourth king, Mongkut, celebrated for his fusion of Western and Thai thinking, was a kind of walking paradigm. Here he is in 1865, thereabouts, seemingly a projection of militarist proto-nationalism, though he was no warrior. He was actually a monk for about 27 years before he ascended to the throne. But for the fact that the uniform is actually that of a French field marshal. This purely formal assimilation of the foreign would be a keynote of reforms to come. In fact, it stems from a cultural logic of absorption and encompassment, of naturalization and nationalization with very much deeper roots, which I'll try to come back to if I have time at the end. The film historian May Ingawanit offers a useful typology of the Sakon, the universal. And I paraphrase her very liberally here for the next minute or so. A term, Sakon, that means universal, but has come to connote westernized and the attainment of modernity. It implies both international community, but also a kind of worldly scale, often paired with the notion of an imposed but desirable global standard originating from somewhere else more advanced than Thailand. It encodes an anxiety about where the Thai ought to fit in this overall Sakon schema. In practice, its inflections speak volumes, for it can also isolate certain groups within Thailand as slavish imitators of Western ways. A further utopian implication of Sakon would challenge Thainess by raising the possibility of transcending the national particularities in favour of universal values or even a cosmopolitan kind of engagement. Yet another inflection conjures up the metaphorical world stage on which Siam must distinguish herself as equal to yet differentiated from the best of nations. This imagines the admiring eyes of the world upon exemplary national figures. So the appearance of Siamese exhibits at world expositions, for example, during the Fifth Reign, late 19th and early 20th century, was proof of the civilizing rule and worldliness of Siam and its royalty. Ingawanit argues that as this structure is ramified on down the social pyramid, as this world stage has morphed into a global market, Sakon's contemporary inflection brings added ambiguities with it. It now suggests exportability. The upshot is a seductive ambivalence, conjoined as Thai Sakon, Thai yet universal. Commercial culture that successfully localizes Western styles or techniques, creating, I quote May here, ostensibly Thai cultural commodities in an internationally legible Western idiom. Now, the most prestigious Thai bourgeois cultural forms are then those that hover in between these two poles. And Ingawanit identifies cinema as a pivotal channel for this kind of projective legitimization. Visual art, for its part, tells a slightly different story, for two reasons. First, because the exhibition of foreign art never became a norm in Thailand. And second, because modern art, albeit engendered and propagated in a Western classical mode, from its inception found institutional patronage, which local cinema did not. And it was a patronage constructed on bureaucratic and feudal terms rather than capitalist ones, from the state and from the palace. When a mercantile upper middle class did start to patronise art in the 1980s, it was precisely to buy symbolic detergents in this nationalist, Buddhist, royalist identity laundry. And it's no accident that the big bang of the Thai art market was an orgy of mostly quite bogus neo-traditionalism. Nevertheless, going inter has long been a kind of trump card in the modern artist's quest for legitimisation, and became an increasingly central ingredient of artistic success in the contemporary era, for anyone interested in looking the part. Now, the sort of concluding section of this talk is going to skirt around this idea of the preternational that I began with, and try to propose some kind of contemporaneity that might indeed be radical in the deconstructive sense that I flag. So you see already that it can be hard in Thailand's case to sort the good ghosts from the bad. What, if anything, is good about this internationalisation that has advanced under the name of contemporary art? What, if anything, is laudable about its pretense or its aspiration to the international and to an international contemporaneity? Does it lie in the sorting through of the legacies of our incomplete and incompletely shared modernities in common? Or, as some would have it, in salvaging from them whatever is worth continuing? Is it about availing ourselves of new powers of connectivity and sharing? Questions for another day. But if there's an international worthy of the capital I, it'll be that which remains wary of the false and merely formal internationalisms, and critical not just of them, but also of the premises of its own claims to the international. With these reservations in mind, let me return then to my treacherous vocabulary and try to the 3 C's. I'm going to try to kind of turn them inside out, and hopefully make them radical and open to their own transformation. This will come down to recognising a fundamental ambivalence, reflexivity. Southeast Asia's contemporary will not refer simply to a fugitive present, but also at the same time be more alive than ever to art's historicity. At the institutional level, such reflexivity may be some way off, but we could acknowledge a modicum of self-consciousness, at least in the appearance since 2003 of OCAC, the Office of Contemporary Art and Culture, Thai contemporary art's first dedicated bureaucracy, set up indeed by Apinan, who I mentioned, which helps to put it on a contemporary international stage. So far, this internationalism has tended towards a camp, ironic nationalism, most disastrously at the 2009 Venice Biennale. But it won't always. And the coming representation by Arin Rungjang, I think, while it harps on the cliched national theme of food, looks set to evince a more critical and I think more historically informed international outlook. Tellingly, it was the curator who, in the contemporary era, went inter first. This middleman was the exemplary arbitrageur, shuttling back and forth between domestic and international spheres, the key broker of the contemporary, not simply chaperone of new, less obviously commodifiable forms on the world stage, but also, and at the same time, frequently the rainmaker for emerging markets at home and abroad. We must be mindful of this figure's ambivalence, not simply advocate of formal and intellectual progress, which he certainly was, but also, and at the same time, an agent of encompassment, of assimilation, often in the name of a far from progressive national form. I steal this phrase from Patrick Flores, by which contemporary art could be rendered serviceable or indeed instrumentalised by national projects with international aspirations. Patrick Flores is thus far, I think, the only one to have explored regionally how curatorial labour facilitated the aestheticisation of national political power. By no means an organ of a popular sovereignty opposed to it, but rather implicated in an equivocal collaboration with it. Even as independent players, these figures, these regional sort of pathfinding regional curators that Patrick has written quite a lot about, even as independent players, these figures were co-authoring the national form in both, and I quote him, deconstructive and affirmative ways. Flores concurs that the early to mid-70s was germinal for the region for this contemporary, even if its shared characteristics only became legible as such rather later on. He's also the only writer, I think, to have thought very deeply about how a promise of democracy, a promise sensed and grasped across Cold War Southeast Asia indeed, was shared and addressed by those engaged in exhibition making. Despite the rather woolly narrative of incipient democratisation that's central to many regionalist accounts of Southeast Asian contemporary art, especially those that are generated, ironically, by Singapore's state museums. What came to pass under the sign of the conceptual? In Thailand's case, almost anything. The word often simply meant non-traditional media, describing the formal dilation of the first self-consciously contemporary generation in the 90s to be widely shown abroad. Everything from participatory art, mail art, agriculture, new media, performance, installation, relational art, happenings, and so on. Some would prefer to claim for all this various kind of vernacularizations of the contemporary and of the conceptual. But such a loose appropriation of the term conceptual, I think, takes the term too far from its art historical moorings to have any coherent meaning, either stylistic, formal, or much less ideological. Few of us would classify Suti Kunawissianon's national totems, his inflatable national totems, as conceptual, but many in Thailand did. Apinan is partly responsible for the mushiness of the term. Surveying regional conceptualism for the 1999 show at the Queen's Museum of Art, entitled Global Conceptualism Points of Origin, 1950s to 1980s. The show was curated by Jane Farver, Louis Kamnitzer, and Rachel Weiss. Surveying the regional conceptualism for this purpose, he found contingency. Rather than any internationalist aesthetic or politics, or if you like, a politics of universal abstract principle, communication, of the critiques of signification, of equally of the transcendence of fine art materiality, rather than any kind of internationalist aesthetics like that, it was actually mostly local socio-political conditions that set the tone for the domestication of conceptual strategies within regional art making. But Apinan's essay on con art is interesting also for, I think, its revelation of the limits of art historiography at the time. The region's preeminent art scholar, no doubt finding his growing curatorial commitments to be more appealing than detailed historical research in an often barren regional archive. The piece unravels into a kind of, this Apinan's piece, unravels into a kind of broad brush surveying, setting the tone indeed for much of the historiography that would follow, the regionalist historiography that would follow. Nevertheless, this exhibition left us already with multiple spirits of the conceptual, announced in the title as a kind of genealogical premise, one that is importantly complicated by its plurality. In line with our radical ambivalence, then, the Southeast Asian conceptual is not simply a discursive lever for relieving art of its obligations to traditional or beaux-arts disciplinary models, its investments in an odious individualist modernism, and it certainly did those. but also and at the same time, a means by which the post-medium artist might maintain or indeed bolster the privilege of the modern artist, re-qualify him or her as seer, tastemaker, sage, by recourse to intellectual, social, or even spiritual, rather than practical expertise. Not simply then a conjurer blurring the distinctions between art and everyday life, between high and low culture, but also and at the same time the alchemist distilling new hybrid product lines from both strata. Not simply worldly pathfinder moving art beyond its identitarian cultural types, but also at the same time redesigning them, rebranding or encrypting them with more topical codes for more sophisticated tastes. You'll appreciate this is kind of a paranoid theorization. For instance, no self-respecting curator of the contemporary would dream of endorsing the ersatz cultural essentialism of a neo-traditionalist like Chalumchai Kosit Pipad, which you see, whose work you see on the left, but they queue up to imbibe the newly spun sustainable eco-Buddhism of a land foundation. Now, a couple of notes here. First, this is not intended to be a kind of moralistic exercise. I don't wish to suggest that all these artists or curators are two-faced. Rather, what's important to me is that it's our vocabulary that is duplicitous here. The second note is that nor is this ultimately about specifying some definitively Southeast Asian contemporaneity. On the contrary, I suspect that the more we flesh this out, this dual E or A logic, the more we'd find a Southeast Asian contemporary to be in step with developments elsewhere. Indeed, this may be a tension lurking much more generally in international contemporary art. Now, by way of conclusion, I just want to suggest a few vectors very quickly and schematically. This is part 2 that is, coming soon. Just a few vectors on which perhaps a radical idea of the contemporary might be traced. It's clear that I'm implying a reflexive and an ambivalent contemporary here. It's also clear, I think, that getting beyond the nation or getting over nationalism is going to be a prerequisite to any good international contemporary art. There will be no internationalism without regionalism. This is a temple very close to, and in fact which makes almost invisible the border between Thailand and Cambodia. It's been the subject, it's under a UNESCO heritage listing, but it has been the subject of very heated clashes, military confrontations, and indeed deaths in the last couple of years. Given my reservations about the inter, I'd suggest that in Thailand's case at least, overtures to the regional neighbourhood would be a necessary first step. If nothing else, this would at least raise consciousness of Thailand's own heritage and heterogeneity, and short-circuit some of the bird-brained populist nationalism that still has Thais and Cambodians, for example, killing each other over rocks. This regional would not, however, mean the various forms of official internationalism that we already see. Neither ASEAN, a Cold War political affiliation now supposedly the basis for a putative economic integration, nor UNESCO, say, and at least notionally internationalist bureaucracy that's right at home in Bangkok, of course, but which most Thais regard with a degree of the polite suspicion that they reserve for imperialists, for the World Trade Organization, organizations like that, nor even the non-aligned movement or the celebrated Bandung Conference of 1955, for it would have to be pre-national, closer perhaps to a very much older political anthropology. So I'll end with a very, very speculative reference here to a book that I'm still making my way through. It's by a political historian anthropologist fellow called James Scott. It's called The Art of Not Being Governed. And Scott proposes the name Zomia to refer to a whole sprawling zone of upland Southeast Asia. So it's a kind, if you like, it's a kind of topographical geography rather than, if you like, the sort of political geography that we're accustomed to dealing with in history. So it's a region that spans many, what we now think of as many different countries, and is characterized primarily in pre-modern times, according to Scott, by precisely its ungovernability. Methods may have changed, but the appropriation of provincial and neighbouring cultures by centralising powers in Southeast Asia is a very old process that began with living bodies and their material surplus, labour and rice. Indeed, all the classical states of mainland Southeast Asia came about through the same single device. That is, the concentration of labour power from elsewhere for the purposes of paddy cultivation. Their glory was closely indexed in the available surplus of this one grain. They were, as Scott writes in his anarchist history of the region, quote, "In every case a polyglot population, the culture of each a work in progress, a kind of contingent vector sum of the various peoples and cultures who chose to identify with it or who were incorporated by force," end quote. As their absorption was a strategic necessity, though, assimilation tended to be made relatively easy, and identity was largely a matter of performance, not of birth or blood, a principle that's in fact no less axiomatic today after centuries of colonial and post-colonial ethnologising. Indeed, Scott's anarchist pre-nationals roaming the hilltops practising a sustainable mixture of Swidden agriculture and hunter-gathering may indeed be the very image of the ambivalent and reflexive political posture that I'm trying to characterise here. Ready for exchange with the sedentary forces down the hill, but ready to split at any time for the safety of the wilds. Alive to the opportunities presented by state absorption, modernity and collaboration, but also, and at the same time, aware of the possibilities beyond it, and free to choose. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Are there some very urgent questions after your wonderfully Baroque epos of presentation? Yes.
Hello. Yes. Well, thank you very much. Amazing paper. And I just wanted to, at the end, it was good that you brought the global conceptualism points of origin as this final, perhaps a moment that kind of the problem might have started. I sort of like kind of read it that way, and how this term of the conceptual as this historiographical term, let's say, homogenized, no? What we conceive as contemporaneity, you place the 3 C's, no? So my perhaps question to your own presentation, and something that I am also shocked in the quotation of Rancière in many of our contemporary language to narrate this criticism over the contemporary. I wonder if actually that contemporary has 3 C's and R, Rancière being, no? And apparently we have the shadow of French post-structuralism as still being the main tool to talk about this. So just like, I wonder, like, maybe you have your own way of saying like why you need Rancière for this, no? The other thing is, maybe outside of, oh no, just one small comment on something that it reminded me when you talk about the exhibition of global conceptualism. There was another exhibition that luckily it did not become as referential, but it's symptomatic of what you criticize all this time in relation to the other C, the curator. An exhibition which, if I'm not mistaken, it was called When Latitudes Become Form, and it was the reaction to Harold Seaman's seminal curatorial exhibition made by curators from the periphery. So I guess both global conceptualism or When Latitudes Become Form, what they basically do is that they reaffirm a canon rather than actually creating new forms of understanding contemporaneity. And the last thing, I'm sorry, Cosmin, oh yes. Just outside of the field of art, I wonder in the specific case of Thailand, my own question, because I really don't know, is that in a moment where I think we all agree that there was a kind of international solidarity, and that is the anti-war movement during Vietnam, because Thailand not actually politically being against the war, but actually kind of like hosting great part of the military bases. Like, how does that actually, in the collective imagery, reveal on what do you conceive as internationalism and solidarity? Giving this non-solidarity moment in Vietnam War and international history. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Inti. I'm not going to be able to really do justice to three very interesting strands that you've raised. Do I need Rancière? No. It's the simple answer to that. In fact, I don't read Rancière, and this was, in a way, a quite flippant quotation of him. The reason that he seemed to tick a box for me for the purposes of this talk was really that there's something going on in that collapse of the two poles that he posits as would-be opposed forces in the contemporary, which he manages to show are in fact all kind of on about the same thing. They're just not really admitting it, and that is to essentially refashion the common or some communal site or space through this redistribution of the, whatever he calls it, redistribution of the sensible. And so in trying to kind of collapse those poles, and I think in doing a fairly convincing job of it, that also ties you in, I think, to a certain chronology, for an art historian's purposes anyway. And I think that it's precisely, and to perhaps flag the Osborne idea as well, I think by now it's clear for us that the question of the contemporary is, and perhaps always was, and at any rate must be configured according to multiple temporalities, And I think that's perhaps why juxtaposing Rancière, not very thoughtfully, I have to admit, with Chang Se-Tung and with these kind of weird multiple avant-gardes that are sedimented away in his stalwartly modernist practice. I think perhaps it was just a serendipitous connection, not anything more. And I'm not capable of getting into the ring with you on Rancière, I'm afraid. Thanks also for pointing out, reminding me of When Latitudes Become Form. It's something that will certainly need to be accounted for in this work. Thailand's place in a Vietnam War, I mean, solidarity would not be a very good word for it. That's my kind of initial answer. Thailand's often, as you apparently know, is regarded as the kind of fixed aircraft carrier of the United States in that period. Nevertheless, the counterculture that I think Chang's works reference could, if nothing else, connect you through both formal and perhaps, you know, art historical links to responses that were indeed much, much wider. And this is why I'm kind of suggesting that perhaps the kind of hegemonic, you know, Euro-American or Euro-US-American narrative may in time be demoted in terms of its clout in the historicization of the conceptual. And yeah, I think that what actually was a reasonably, certainly for a Thai artist, is regarded as a very direct encounter with authoritarianism and figuring of authoritarian history. So yeah, I'm by no means able to make more sense of comparisons with other countries on the spot, but yeah, I think that's, if you ask about the Vietnam War, I think that would be where I would go. It would be how did this violence contribute to the other violences in that that pile of sediment. Yeah.
Is there a brief question?
I'll try my best. Actually, it's a two-part question, but it's brief. The first one is, it's a very personal one. I'd like to know, you know that I'm a fan of your lectures, I've told you before. Why it is that you feel that it's necessary to put so much into one talk? Whether it is because you haven't finished or you think all this needs to be known, or whether that's a kind of regional impulse that goes against simplistic narratives of your region or something like that, or whether it's a disciplinary thing coming from your background. I'm just interested personally why you're doing that. The second question is, did I understand correctly that the preternational is something that is maybe not there right now, but will be, you're hoping that, you know, might be a description, maybe not right in this present, but the next step from the present, and that it should be fed and derived from the pre-natural?
Yeah, the
in terms of freedom.
Simple answer is yes. Okay, to go back to the first thing, yes, it's absolutely the density, which I should apologize for, you're quite right, is absolutely in an attempt to kind of offset the kind of art theorization and art historicization that I have tended to be circulating in, which is anything but dense. You know, and I think that there's a lot of vocabulary that has not been sufficiently interrogated on both sides, both within the region, but also from people who speak of it elsewhere. So perhaps, yeah, also a disciplinary background that's guilty as charged. You know, and I actually work in a university, and you know, I try to publish this kind of shit. So, the second part about the preternational, yes, it was very deliberately left completely vague, but it is perhaps the sense of an international to come for my purposes here. And at this point, you know, with the first sketch down, the vaguer the better. But yeah, I would, on instinct anyway, I would make a deliberate, I would insist that it begin with the pre-national. I think that the countries in the region that I work in have almost, I can't think of an exception, have very little reason to think about the pre-national. And their modern histories, their modern experience has not furnished them with obvious reasons why they should be interested in that past. You can see on the street every day the deleterious effects of that absence, that ignorance. In the classroom, it's shocking. So yeah, I mean, I think whether or not it ends up in the ideal capital I international to come is perhaps not the point for me, but the point is that you won't get there without going via that route. Yeah. I hope that sort of answers.
David, thank you very much once again. And now, since we are a little bit late,